Good evening. My name is Mike Tierney, and I direct the Global Research Institute here at William & Mary. GRI is a multidisciplinary hub that brings together scholars, practitioners, and students to conduct applied research on global problems. Tonight's keynote conversation is sponsored by GRI's Security and Foreign Policy Initiative, which is generously supported by the Charles Koch Foundation, Laura Holmes Jost, and Paul Jost, class of 76, who should be in the audience tonight. And they're right here in the front row. So if you want to, thanks, Tim. If you'd like to speak to them, they will be at the reception afterwards, and you can talk about good old times at William & Mary. So this initiative seeks to meet William & Mary's student demand for courses and for research opportunities in the areas of U.S. foreign policy and international security, and to diversify William & Mary's theoretical approaches to the study of these subjects. While diversity is a dirty word in some quarters these days, we continue to believe that any great university needs to provide a broad range of perspectives on important questions of the day. And SFPI certainly helps us to do that. Now, we plan to have an in-person conference on power vacuums and great power competition in February, but the snowpocalypse that hit Williamsburg, 4 inches of snow, completely shut down the university, and we had to pivot to host a remote conference that was really quite fun and relegated us to making snow angels. But needless to say, we're very excited to see you all in person tonight and to have this great panel. And we're hopeful that you'll stay around after the keynote panel for a reception that will feature student poster presentations on great power competition, beer, wine, hors d'oeuvres. All of this go best with brain food, so please stick around after the panel. For this keynote discussion, we've shifted our focus to assess a traditional milestone in the annals of American presidential history, the first 100 days. If you've been keeping track over the past 3 months, you know that this Trump administration's approach to U.S. foreign policy has shifted, sometimes dramatically, from the post-war foreign policy consensus, and has even shifted compared to the first Trump administration from 2017 to 2020. This evening, we have a great panel that will help us to describe, contextualize, and understand Trump's foreign policy. In addition, these folks are well placed to help us forecast the responses of other international actors and potential outcomes that may result. So tonight we're joined by 3 panelists. Dr. Dan Drezner is Distinguished Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Dr. Drezner has written 7 books, including The Ideas Industry, All Politics is Global, and my personal favorite, International Politics and Zombies. Dr. Drezner holds a PhD in political science from Stanford University. Now, I should say, until recently, Dan was a respected member of the professoriate, but recently he has taken a position on the dark side of academia. Dan is now a dean. So I'm sure all of his commentary tonight will be measured and politically correct. Our next panelist is Rosemary Kalanick, Director of Middle East Programs at Defense Priorities. Dr. Kalanick is the author of Black Gold and Blackmail, Oil and Great Power Politics. She taught political science for 10 years at Notre Dame and Williams College and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. Finally, we're joined on this panel by Dr. Stephen Wertheim, Senior Fellow with the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Wertheim is the author of Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy. He holds a PhD in history from Columbia University, and we're counting on Stephen tonight to put the Trump administration in historical perspective. Steering our conversation tonight is my colleague and good friend, Samantha Custer. Sam is the Director of Policy Analysis at ADATA, which is a research lab here at GRI. Sam works at the intersection of academia and the policy world. She produces applied research ranging from international development to Chinese public diplomacy to U.S. foreign policy. She's worked very closely with our Chancellor, Robert M. Gates, to produce original research volumes supporting the first 2 Gates Forums. Sam holds dual masters in foreign service and public policy from Georgetown University. Please note that after the discussion, Sam will open the floor to Q&A. So be sure to get your questions ready. Please raise your hand and we'll come find you with a microphone. I kindly ask that you briefly identify yourself and ask a brief question that is on point for the panel tonight. Okay, Sam, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. Thanks to all of you. I don't think we have a lot to talk about in this last 100 days, so we might end early and you can enjoy the hors d'oeuvres outside. No, we actually have a lot to talk about. As Mike alluded to, this idea of the first 100 days has been something that we have watched from presidential administration to administration. This is usually a time to set a tone, to signal priorities, to indicate what an administration wants to focus on and what it wants to be known for. What is significant, though, in particular about this administration, at least for me, is just the velocity with which new information is coming out and the broad sweeping changes that we're seeing in these first 100 days. So this is a chance for an intervention. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to raise your hand if this describes you. I find myself in a heightened state of alert, reflexively checking my newsfeed on my phone every few minutes. Raise your hand. Okay. Another day, another executive order. This has become my new normal. Raise your hand. A few days has passed by, and I don't see a newly leaked memo showing up in my social media feed. I think something is malfunctioning. Raise your hand. Okay. So it is easy when you're trying to straddle the worlds of policy and academia. When you have a first 100 days, like this 100 days, like we'll be talking about tonight, to just be so focused on the details that as they are dropping and becoming inundated with the details as they are dropping. But as scholars and practitioners at the Global Research Institute, and we invite you all to be part of that family tonight, we also have a responsibility to take the long view, to try to situate this historic administration in so many ways in the past, and to make sense of how that fits in our future as a country, as the United States, and as a global community. And so that's what we're going to try to do tonight, is to try to take a pulse on the present with these very smart people around me, to take a look at how does this compare and contrast to our past, and where might this be taking us in the future? So that is the goal tonight. I can't think of better counterparts to tackle these questions than you all. So let me go first to you, Dan. So I want to pose a question at the 50,000-foot level to really think about this from a strategic perspective. You can jump if you like. So what do you see when you look at the Trump administration's first 100 days? What do you see that this is signaling about how Trump understands the sources of American power, our national interests, and role in the world?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for inviting me here. This is a great panel. I'm honored to be here. The mic should be on, actually. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. There we go. What I would say is that what's been revealed from the first 100 days is that Trump has an extremely narrow theory of power. One of the things about international relations, and it's a really embarrassing fact about what we do for a living, is that power is the central currency of what we talk about, and we don't have a common definition of what it means. But we have a lot of different kinds of descriptions of power. There's military power, there's economic power, there's soft power. There's a whole variety of sort of iterations on this. Based on what Trump has done for the first 100 days, it is clear that he is interested in two things primarily. The first is the idea that he can somehow use economic coercion to force the rest of the world to rewrite the rules of the game in a way that more, that favors the United States more, particularly with respect to economics. And Trump has always been focused on the economic dimension of power. This is consistent from his first term. But he's not interested at all in soft power. He's not interested at all in promoting democratic values. He's not interested at all in promoting human rights. If anything, you could argue he's slightly interested in the reverse in terms of his pattern. He also seems to be interested in in magnifying military power in the sense of the preliminary military budget we've seen. But I think the other interesting thing, and the part that makes Trump truly a throwback to the 19th century, is he seems legitimately interested in expanding American borders, which is weird. That's the IR term for it. Which is to say, I mean, he's been very clear from the State of the Union that he thinks that the United States needs to expand its territory, whether it's by annexing Greenland or by shifting the border with Canada or shifting the border with Mexico or taking back the Panama Canal Zone or even occupying Gaza. This is something, you know, the U.S. hasn't expanded its continental borders in quite some time. And I think that he seems to feel like in a zero-sum world, which is what his mindset is, you know, he thinks if other countries are getting rich, that automatically means the United States must be getting poor. In a zero-sum world, territory does matter. And so I do think that the zero-sum mindset is causing him to believe we have to expand our territories. That's the way we're going to get rich.
So what I'm hearing from you, Dan, is that we have a president that has an expansive view of physical territory and our boundaries, but a narrow view of the tools that you use to be able to assert your influence on the global stage. I'll go next to Rose. Do you agree with that assessment? Would you elaborate or disagree?
Yeah, I would agree. I also agree that it is weird. It is zombie-esque back to the 19th century. I agree pretty much with everything that Dan says. But what I find really difficult to wrap my head around and also kind of fascinating is the ways in which, you know, the first 100 days, so I've been thinking it's like the old joke about the French Revolution, like how did it turn out? It's too soon to tell, right? It really is too soon to tell, but in certain ways, Trump seems very interested in changing things, yet there's a lot of stasis at the same time. So there's this renewed focus on the Western Hemisphere, right, that we haven't had since the 19th century. But, you know, I work primarily on Middle East issues these days. When it comes to the Middle East, there's remarkably little change in terms of what Trump has actually done since coming into office and what he's signaled, right? So whereas during the campaign and in previous years, Trump spoke a lot about avoiding sort of endless wars, you know, saying, for instance, Syria is not our fight, all these other sorts of things. There hasn't been a sort of corresponding change in American force posture in the Middle East. We've seen some big changes in Europe, potentially, or at least talk of big changes. But it's kind of amazing to me that for all the talk that there has been about, oh, you know, the Middle East is not a region that we need to worry about very much. When I think about the resources, the political resources, the amount of time that they've been spending attention, you know, paying attention to the Middle East or paying attention to any part of the world, it seems to be the largest place that they're paying attention, which is surprising to me.
That's an interesting contrast then, because essentially, you know, when you're looking at the micro detailed view, it seems like things are changing constantly. But from the macro perspective, you're actually seeing fairly incremental change, if that. I want to turn to you, Stephen. Can you elaborate a little bit on your views and how they are similar and different to what you've heard from your colleagues?
Well, first of all, thanks to the GRI for bringing me here and us here to have this conversation. Your question, part of your question was about what Trump's view of U.S. national interests is. And I think that remains a mystery, not because, you know, people are not trying to pay attention and understand Trump, but because Trump himself doesn't have a clear view. I think Dan is right that, you know, what is at the center of Trump's worldview or MO is to try to renegotiate existing arrangements on the assumption that, you know, Trump's predecessors have gotten it wrong and Trump is going to make a quote unquote better deal. To the extent Trump has an ideology, it's the ideology that every interaction, you know, ends up, yes, it's zero sum, but then it ends up in a deal. Even if it doesn't, or, you know, he hasn't quite figured out how to get that deal. So the remarkable thing I think about this administration is that it has substantial numbers of personnel who have really different views of what America's role in the world should be, what American grand strategy should be. Should the United States be militarily present in the Middle East, for example? There's a lot of people in the administration who would say no. That is itself remarkable if you think about the post-Cold War era, where, including Trump's first administration, where, most people would have accepted the notion that the United States should, have dozens of overseas military alliances, probably that those alliances should be looking to expand rather than contract, and that the United States should be trying to take a preeminent political military role in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, simultaneously, to say nothing of the Western Hemisphere. There is some real fundamental disagreement on those grand strategy questions within this administration. And one of the reasons that is happening is that Trump himself doesn't really have a clear view on these questions. So he is kind of open to entertaining different points of view on these quite fundamental questions. At the same time, this is his second go-around as president of the United States. He's got 4 years to go. Perhaps he should make up his mind. And so I think we're seeing this play out in a few different areas, including Europe, really all of the regions of the world, where many aspects of U.S. Policy under the Trump administration seem very much unsettled, especially and rather surprisingly when it comes to Asia and how this administration wants to relate to the People's Republic of China, which Trump did so much to, recast as an adversary of the United States during his first term. This time, it's not clear where he wants to go aside from ratcheting up tariffs.
So then that's useful in the sense, Stephen, that, it's tempting, it sounds like, to view the Trump administration as monolithic in their, who is determining the priorities. But what you're alluding to is something that is far less monolithic, far less uniform, where priorities are being contested at every level. Let's take for a minute something that you focus on a lot in your work, Europe policy. So thinking about Trump's posture vis-a-vis Ukraine, Russia, NATO. As you look at that particular landscape of the world, what would you say are Trump's priorities in that region? And how do you see the nature of how he defines allies, adversaries, changing?
So clearly one of Trump's oldest, most consistent beliefs, political beliefs, is that allies are ripping off the United States. He has always applied that view to European allies, but the critique has sharpened since he was out of office, in large part because of the war in Ukraine. And that critique has become more widely shared also by some personnel that are now serving in the Trump administration, which coincides with concerns about U.S. resource constraints in a world of rising major power competition. What are Trump's priorities? Clearly to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine, which he campaigned on. Trump actually cares, I think, about fulfilling his campaign promises. And I think he's actually quite sincere about wanting to see the conflict come to an end. But then the question becomes, if he can't do that in relatively short order, what does he make of the conflict and America's stakes in the conflict? And I think what he's signaled is that if he deems Ukraine to have been the party that obstructed a settlement, he will cut off U.S. support for Ukraine, so that, as a political matter, the war in Ukraine does not become Trump's war. It is currently Joe Biden's war, in his view. He's there to end it as quickly and simply as possible. And so I think his view is that, if the war is still ongoing and the United States is continuing to send a lot of aid to Ukraine 2-3 years into his presidency, that's worse of an outcome for him than simply washing his hands of the affair. At the same time, we've seen the administration reach out to Russia. It's not clear, what the results will be, but I do think we are seeing an attempt to establish constructive relations with Moscow on a separate track from the way the war in Ukraine might play out. So I think that is something certainly to watch, and is, a fairly distinctive policy to this administration. Another Republican, for example, might not have gone down that route. And with respect to the U.S. role in European security, again, I think it could go in a number of different directions, but Secretary of Defense Hegseth came to Europe and signaled that what he wanted to do, and what the Trump administration wanted to do, was to reduce the U.S. Conventional military capability on the continent and see European allies, in his words, take ownership of European defense. So he wants to see a security transition in Europe, something I think is overdue and a good idea. I'm not sure it's a done deal, though. The Europeans themselves are now planning and thinking about this possibility as they really haven't done before. So something has been put into motion that might continue even if Washington itself doesn't keep pushing in this direction. Trump himself, though, is mainly concerned, as I see it, about allies paying enough for U.S. protection, and that's a somewhat different concern from the concern of others in his administration, including the Pentagon, who want to see the United States expend less costs and bear less risk for defending Europe. Because I think from Trump's concerns about burden sharing, a solution might be, as he suggested on the campaign trail, to make U.S. adherence to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the collective security guarantee, conditional on how much another European country is paying for defense. And that would actually mean the United States would still be responsible for protecting the countries in Europe that spend the most, precisely because they're closest to Russia and most threatened by Russia. So it would not actually change the strategic equation. So we'll have to see whether, first of all, Secretary Hegseth survives, but also whether that direction of policy is one that this administration makes a determined effort to implement.
So one of the things that struck me as you were speaking, Stephen, about the desire on the Trump administration's part to see greater burden sharing within NATO, to come to a ceasefire agreement and end to a conflict in Ukraine. There's a certain amount of impatience that you see in how Trump is engaging in these conversations that may run into difficulties with the kind of time that it takes for these changes to take place. And that makes me think, I think, of your work, Rose, in the Middle East. When you think about a region of the world where conflicts are longstanding and deep and complicated to navigate, you're talking about Iran and nuclear proliferation, you're dealing with counterterrorism, with Hamas, the Houthis. Tell me a little bit, when you think about the Trump administration's stance towards the Middle East and that part of the world, what do you see as his priorities? What do you see as how he's thinking about allies and adversaries?
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. In some ways, a lot of his policies are a continuation of what we had under Biden and Trump himself before. Something that he clearly seems to think is a priority, at least in the past month or so, is the Iran nuclear program, and trying to potentially work out a deal to get Iran to potentially walk back aspects of its program. Or, it's one of these things where different people in the administration have set forth different goals. Sometimes the goal is to get them back to something like what the deal was before that Trump walked away from during his first term in office. Other times, they seem to be pretty intent on making sure Iran doesn't get the bomb, not just that it doesn't get the bomb, but that it totally gets rid of its nuclear program, which is basically not going to happen. And so to me, I think it's kind of a strange tree to bark up because, Iran had been quietly enriching uranium, now can enrich up to 60%. If you can enrich up to 60%, it's pretty easy to enrich up to 90%, which is what you need for a bomb. And they've been doing that for 4 or 5 years at least, right? But Iran hasn't gotten a bomb, right? I think one of the big ironies of this situation is that all of this pressure being put on Iran might be the thing that actually finally lights the fire under them to actually weaponize their program and get a bomb, right? But to me, it's kind of a strange tree to be barking up because it's one that has so little upside in terms of solutions, right? At this point, there's not very much the United States or Israel or anybody can do to prevent them from weaponizing. The easiest way to get them to weaponize is by attacking them, which is the threat that's been on the table, right? The reason why Iran and most other countries want nuclear weapons is because they're the ultimate deterrent. They're not a perfect deterrent, but if you want to stay in power, you want to survive as a country, you get nuclear weapons, it's your best shot, right? What better reason to get them than to be under pressure from the United States and Israel? So, he's been leaning quite heavily into that in the past month. I think it's puzzling because I don't see this as a winning issue for him or for the United States or really anybody. The Houthis, they've played, they've been in the news. The Signal chat leak, of course, that was all about the Houthis. Again, it's not clear sort of what the end goal is or what the sort of big picture is, but there does seem to be an interest in appearing muscular, right, and appearing strong, perhaps as a negotiating tactic, unclear. I don't think that we can bomb the Houthis as much as we want, and it's probably not going to stop what they're doing in the Red Sea. And probably people in the administration realize that. So I think they're doing it to try to convey a message that, hey, there's a new team in town and we're tough this time, we really mean it. And Iran, by the way, we're looking at you. We know you supported the Houthis, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly, the big adversary is Iran. Yet, on the same, on the flip side, Trump has said nice things about Iran and said, I think Iran could be a great country and I want to have peace with Iran. I mean, Trump is not a warmonger. So there's this strange kind of duality with it, but they seem to be the biggest sort of bad guy in the region. Trump is apparently going to Rome, to the Vatican, to the Pope's funeral, but before that, his first trip abroad was going to be to Saudi Arabia. So as much as Trump has sort of looked at allies in Europe and sort of turned up his nose or looked askance at them, he seems to be pretty all in with, deepening partnerships with people in the Middle East, like with the Saudi regime, with the Israelis, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of where I see things going, and it's puzzling in a whole variety of ways.
So kind of picking up on this theme these two themes actually that you mentioned, Rose, of the posturing to be seen as muscular and tough and the new team is in town. And then yet also this interesting duality that, you're painting, an adversary as an adversary, but at the same time you want to make a deal. I can think of no better segue, Dan, to your specialty in economic policy, right? Because we're talking about the president who wrote a book, The Art of the Deal, and has yet shown...
wrote in quotes there. I think
wrote
that's
in
important,
quotes.
but go ahead.
Ghost written in quotes. But yet seems to favor using economic sticks rather than carrots. So could you speak a little bit to how we should interpret Trump's economic policy priorities and how he's thinking about allies and adversaries?
I'm sorry. The way to interpret Donald Trump's trade policy is that it's a dumb policy executed in the most moronic way possible. Sorry. I'll say that a little louder. Donald Trump's trade policy is a dumb policy executed in the most moronic way possible. I want to be very clear about this. In the sense that, the trade policy is predicated on the notion that because the U.S. runs trade deficits, that's a sign of weakness. which is a really weird way. Again, I keep using this word, but it's an odd way of thinking about it. But nonetheless, if you want to argue that there's macroeconomic imbalances, that we should somehow have a slightly more balanced way of thinking about trade, okay, maybe I can sort of understand that. The way they have gone about this has been about as counterproductive as humanly possible, which is to say, if what you are really concerned about is the fact that the United States is running such a large trade deficit, presumably you want to target the country that you think is also the greatest geopolitical threat, which is China. What are you going to do? Maybe you're going to try to get a coalition to go after China or to at least try to negotiate with China. That's not what Trump does. What Trump does instead is apply a blunderbuss and just say, I'm going to put tariffs on everyone. And then watch as both the stock market and bond market freak out in ways that actually threaten. As I said before, I don't know if Donald Trump truly understands the foundations of American economic power. And one of the interesting things during reciprocal tariff week was that it wasn't just that the stock market started gyrating, it was that the bond market started reacting in a way that it didn't react in prior financial crises, that interest rates went up rather than down. In other words, people were trying to get out of dollar-denominated assets. And that should be an extremely serious warning shot across the bow for U.S. financial hegemony. That is a serious concern if you're the Trump administration, which is why they then back down, somewhat in order this 90-day pause. And now you're seeing this attempt to sort of sane wash what the strategy is, which is to say, now we're really going to negotiate all these deals, and then we're going to confront China. And all I have to say is that if you're Europe or Vietnam or any of these other countries that face this tariff, are you really going to trust that you're going to be able to negotiate a deal with Donald Trump to then go after China? I'm pretty skeptical of that. And also, we're supposed to have this situation where we're negotiating 90 different trade deals in 90 days with an administration that is the D list of GOP foreign policy talent. I am very skeptical that any of this will end well. Sorry, you touched a nerve there.
By design, I swear.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful. So talking about economic policy, one of the things that you mentioned was just the market reactions to a lot of these movements, which kind of brings me to the next topic I wanted to grapple with you on. And here we're kind of straddling a little bit of the present day and kind of looking back in time a little bit to the campaign promises that he was making. We had a first term with Trump. There was the whole Project 2025 set of recommendations. So, there's been a lot of surprises from the flood the zone strategy of just so much coming out so quickly. But when you look at the substance of the policies that the Trump administration are putting forward, how much should we really be surprised from what was promised before? Or do you see a lot of daylight, a change or a shift from what was anticipated? Let me go first to you, Stephen. You're the historian, so tell us.
No pressure.
I think, so some people had the idea that because there was a first Trump administration, the second Trump administration would look similar. And that is being invalidated by the day. So I think what we're seeing is a President Trump who is now much better able and much more willing to act on what it is that President Trump wants to do in international affairs. And as we've said, there are holes in his own mind, contradictions about what it is he wants to do. But he is personally a more confident, emboldened figure, and he has now people around him who are selected first and foremost because they are going to be loyal to him, and whatever he decides, their top priority is going to be to do it. And secondly, there have arisen in Washington and elsewhere around the president's campaign a set of experts who realized that the first time around there were better directions from their point of view that President Trump might have gone in terms of policy, and but there weren't the personnel in place to implement it. So now you have people in the administration who, some of them contributed to Project 2025, but it's bigger than that. I think it would still be roughly the same even if Project 2025 hadn't been published. Who have put some intellectual meat on the bones of Trumpism. Still, that leaves major questions about, how policy will actually play out. My colleagues and I released a report toward the end of last year about how strategic change is made in U.S. foreign policy. We went back, from 1945 forward to look at how, large-scale changes that at least some people in the U.S. government wanted to make were either accomplished or stymied. And, this administration has taken some steps to be able to put themselves in a position to make changes, like trying to rein in the bureaucracy, install political appointees who share the president's vision, et cetera. But I think the kind of major obstacle it kind of occurs at step one, which is like what actual change does the administration want to make in a number of areas? And as Dan was suggesting, even in this area of economic policy, which clearly is a Trump priority, he loves tariffs. He is self-proclaimed tariff man. They were reportedly scrambling to the last moment on Liberation Day to figure out how they were going to calculate these tariffs. And then within a week, the reciprocal tariffs, which aren't actually reciprocal, have been delayed for 90 days. But that's only setting us up for more uncertainty because they'd have to average one deal a day for the next 90 days. So we're already behind. And then they'll have to make another choice about whether to further delay those reciprocal tariffs, et cetera, while a massive trade war with China is now underway. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
So since you mentioned tariffs and economic policy, I'm going to go back to you next, Dan. And, I guess if you think about foreign policy, a lot of this can feel kind of out of sight, out of mind to, your average American household. But if there's one thing that does have a way of hitting, the checkbook and the kitchen table, it is economic policy. Did Americans who voted for Trump, do you think they're getting what they thought he was going to give? Tell us a little bit more your view of like the promise versus the delivery.
Okay, I'm going to start by defending Donald Trump a little bit, which is to say, if you didn't think that he was going to impose tariffs, you weren't listening at all during the campaign. Say what you will about Trump, he was very clear in saying that he was going to do this for the last 2 or 3 years. Donald Trump really did believe, like there were 3 things that he focused on. First was tariffs, the second was tax cuts, and the third was energy exploration. And that was his theory of how he was going to jumpstart the economy. Also immigration. Anyone who is surprised by this was not paying attention. Now, to be fair, most American voters don't pay attention. As you say, most American voters are, in the political science lingo, rationally ignorant, which means not stupid. It means politics is a luxury for them, that they are busy people, and ordinarily they're not going to pay that much attention to what's going on. And what I'm sure an awful lot of ordinary voters did was retrospectively think about Trump's first term. Remember that there were a lot of crazy things that he said during the campaign that wound up not implementing during his first term. And his first term, while, until the pandemic, economically seemed okay. And I think that's why one of the big reasons he won in 2024. Now, while the American voters weren't paying attention, what is striking to me also, though, is the degree to which Wall Street and Silicon Valley were paying attention and nonetheless didn't take Trump seriously. It was legitimately impressive the degree to which they've been able to rationalize, or were able to rationalize, what Trump said during the campaign, which was they took him at his word when it came to tax cuts. But when it came to tariffs, they thought, oh, this is just him blowing off steam, or it's a tool of coercive bargaining. He doesn't really mean this. We're going to hand wave it. And now suddenly they're living with the carnage. What I don't think they realize is that, and as Stephen said, I completely agree with, the Trump administration was almost at war with itself during the first term because he didn't really expect to win, and he wound up hiring a lot of traditional Republicans. And he also had to deal with a pretty traditional GOP Congress. The difference this time around is that the one uniform requirement to be hired by Trump is loyalty. And also, more equally important, GOP majorities in Congress are very Trumpy in a way that they were not in 2017. In 2017, Rex Tillerson proposed to cut the State Department budget by up to 50%. And it was Senate Republicans, including, by the way, Marco Rubio, who howled in protest at this, saying, what, are you crazy? This is nuts. Now you're seeing this stuff happening, and Congress has been completely quiescent on this. The other thing I would say, at least in terms of the trade stuff, or more generally, is the one thing that's new with Trump in his second term, beyond the loyalty, is that he really does seem to be invoking the sort of Silicon Valley ethos of how to govern, which is act first, clean up later, break stuff as a way of disruption. And to be fair, this is a culture that in Silicon Valley maybe works. I'm not going to judge. It's a horrible way of governing. What Trump has demonstrated in his first 100 days is that it is easier than I think anyone imagined to destroy a whole variety of institutions. If you had told me 100 days ago, USAID as we know it would no longer exist, I would not have believed you. I would have believed there would have been cuts. I would have believed there would have been efforts. I wouldn't have believed the institution would have been destroyed. But it is much easier to destroy an institution than to create one. And so I'm not sure yet anyone really appreciates the degree to which what this is going to look like 4 years from now, in terms of whether any of what's happened now can actually be resuscitated, I guess.
So, yeah, please, I was actually going to go right to you next. We've heard a little bit what this looks like from the economic side. I'm wondering, I know you work closely on defense, energy issues. Are you seeing parallels to what Dan is describing, or something very different in the areas you focus on?
Yeah, so I actually just sort of wanted to respond in general, which is, as my colleagues have been talking about it, these 90 deals in 90 days, it's gee, it's too bad we don't have an institution that could make all of this work more, efficiently, and oh yeah, we do. It's the World Trade Organization, right? I sort of feel like there's a lot of reinventing the wheel, and I feel like I can impute sort of a logic behind it that may just be my own trying to make sense of the Rorschach test that is the Trump administration, that I also think is ironic and won't work, which is to say, I feel like Trump sort of is from operating this post-Cold War idea of oh, we have all these liberal institutions and they're so dumb and who cares about human rights and all this stuff is highfalutin that we don't care about, in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. We want to reinvigorate the United States. I want to bring manufacturing back. I want to expand the territory, all of these kind of neo-mercantilist kind of policies, right? I can see a justification. I could imagine historians 100 years from now looking back and saying, clearly this is all a response to the rise of China. And this is Trump's attempt to sort of reinvigorate the United States, expand, grow the economy, bring back manufacturing so that the US can compete with China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that's really sort of the grand strategic plan, because I'm not sure there is a grand strategic plan. But if I had to say, what is it? I would imagine something like that. But the irony of it is that it doesn't understand sort of where this liberal international order came from, why it existed, how it helped the United States win the Cold War, right? All this other kind, it wasn't just sort of that the US was doing this for altruistic purposes, but after World War II, it established all these trade institutions, monetary institutions, all this stuff, in order to help Western Europe recover from the devastation of World War II so that it could help with the United States to balance the Soviets and contain the Soviets, right? And so there was always a strategy and a very sort of big geopolitical strategy behind that integration, behind that trade, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you could make the argument, certainly, that today, if you really want to balance against China, or you really want to hedge against China, or whatever verb you want to use, trying to get other countries involved with you seems like a necessity, right? The idea that we're sort of pushing all of them away doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it especially doesn't make sense because China is just a different animal from the Soviet Union. And I don't want to threat inflate, because the United States is a very safe country. We have nuclear weapons. We're far away from all of our enemies. All of that's true. But China,
Except for Canada.
who we are determined to turn into an enemy, it seems. China's 1.4 billion people, right? They're 4 times our size, right? The United States used to worry during the Cold War, well, what if the Soviets conquered Western Europe? Then they'd be able to threaten us. China, just by growing, could end up having the latent power that the Soviet Union could never have even dreamed of in their wildest dreams, right? So, the United States has to, if the big threat is China, and I don't want to say that China is big and scary and ooh, bad, scary red China, but if that's really what's worrying you, it makes sense to have these kinds of partnerships to sort of deal with that threat, right? Anyway.
Yeah, that's great. And, we started the conversation really fixated on the navel gazing of what's happening in the U.S., but you're rightly pointing out the fact that when we're engaging with other countries, there's a whole other global ecosystem out there that the U.S. needs to be engaging with these other players and understand these equities. And, what you're alluding to, though, strikes me as the fact that the global ecosystem, of course, post-Cold War hasn't remained static. You alluded to China's growth. There are other dynamics in play where you see the U.S. actually having a waning economic and security advantage. On the flip side, I actually field surveys of leaders in 148 low and middle income countries, and increasingly you're seeing challenges of perceived legitimacy deficit in our current institutions. And so this does create kind of an opportunity. I'm being Pollyannish. I'm kind of flipping the script a little bit to say, okay, the U.S. through President Trump has broken glass. We are not committed to our current order as it stands, our institutions. If you could kind of shape or advise the Trump administration on what a constructive way to rebuild these international institutions in light of this new global reality, what would that look like? I'm going to go to you first, since you instigated the question.
It's just such a different reality. It's just such a different reality. Because China is in the institutions too, right? In a way that the Soviet Union never was. There were just 2 parallel systems, and they weren't totally parallel because the Soviets just never traded as much as we did anyway, with other countries. But the world was just bifurcated in a way that it's not today, right? And so, there's arguments for, honestly, I feel like you could look back on the last 20 or 30 years of U.S. policy and economic policy towards China and be like, wow, the U.S. was really dumb. You can make the argument in different ways, right? But the argument that prevailed after the end of the Cold War was China is going to grow and maybe someday could become a threat. Ergo, let's have lots of economic interdependence with China. And at the time, the thinking was economic interdependence prevents war, and economic interdependence makes countries rich. Rich countries democratize. Democracies don't fight each other. And so there was all this sort of logic that was if we engage China, they'll be our friend, they'll turn into a democracy, we can neutralize this threat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The time to, that turned out not to be the case, right? Jury's still out on economic interdependence. I really hope it does prevent war, because we do have that going for us with China, right? But China did not democratize, right? That ended up being just enough, it just never happened. We were totally wrong about that. And so, I feel like we could look back 30 years from now and say, wow, that was a really misguided thing to do. The US traded with China for decades, benefited from that trade, but not as much as China did, right? There was a relative gains issue that China benefited more, and the US has now helped China, get enriched to the point where it is now potentially a threat or could be a threat to the United States in the future. Boy, that was kind of a mistake, right? You know, at some point, China is going to be such a big economic powerhouse, and it might be now, that countries, if they had to pick who would you rather work with, the United States or China, might pick China, right? It's just a huge market, right? They have huge economic potential. I'm sure Dan can say much more about this because you're, you know, a political economy person, but, you know, the smart thing would have been to potentially try to, I don't know, exclude China from some of these arrangements a decade ago or more, right? And, you know, try to encourage countries to you know, have an interdependent, growing economic relationship with the United States that didn't benefit China so much at a time when China was less important than it is economically now, right? And I do think that the United States, with all of this chaos and upheaval in the past 90 days, 100 days, you know, if more and more countries are going to be like, gee, who would I rather work with if push comes to shove? Would I rather work with the United States? Would I rather work with China? Like the U.S. has just been so inconsistent that China at least has consistency going for them, right? So I think the U.S. has made some mistakes. You know, it's hard to say we shouldn't have traded with China all that time. Like, it's hard to argue with, you have hundreds of millions of Chinese coming out of poverty, like that's a good thing from like just a, you know, human perspective. But there are also consequences that we are dealing with now.
So maybe I'll go to Dan next. You know, there's definitely, as Rose is alluding to, challenges with our historical international institutions, you know, questions about whether the U.S. could or should have done anything differently. But now we're at this moment where the U.S. is withdrawing from a number of institutions. You have discontent in the global South in terms of whether these institutions really reflect their voices. And now the U.S. is saying that it doesn't reflect its interests. So I'm putting you on the spot, you know, like if you could try to whisper in the ear of the Trump administration, what would you like to see in terms of these future institutions and the U.S. role within it? Easy questions tonight.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is stop punching yourself in the face. Really, like if you want to actually demonstrate any kind of leadership, you know, zigzagging constantly to follow up on what Rose said, you know, part of what the Trump administration is doing is giving a strategic gift to China, in which they can go around the world and say, look, we're not the ones who are acting crazy here. We're not the ones who are threatening people with tariffs. We're not the ones who are exiting international agreements. The funny thing is that the Trump administration might, you know, have grievances about global economic governance. In the way they've carried this out, they have actually managed to make China look like the institutional steward, the responsible stakeholder that administration after administration prior to Trump have tried to get China to be. You know, there's a measure called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index in the United States that measures the degree to which consumers and investors don't know what the policy is. That index is now higher than at any point that it's ever been recorded, which includes the 2008 financial crisis and includes the pandemic. So I'm not kidding when I say stop punching yourself in the face. What, you know, Stephen talked about how it's difficult to discern what the strategy is. Honestly, this is the thing that Trump has never been able to figure out, and I don't know if he's congenitally capable of figuring it out. Trump campaigned in 2016 blasting prior administrations for being so predictable and arguing we need to be unpredictable. That's the way we can generate tactical bargaining advantage. And one could generously argue there are certainly times where there are benefits to tactical surprise. But one of the biggest reasons we articulate grand strategies is precisely so we can signal to everyone what our intentions are and what our methods are of getting there. And the problem with this administration, to go back to what's been said, is that it's not entirely clear what Trump wants, particularly in the economic sphere. And it's definitely not obvious how they're going to get there, except it involves a lot of tariffs. And so, in some ways, this is the second term has been a shoot first and ask strategic questions later kind of administration, and that they've been taking action. And you're seeing, and this has been throughout the media coverage of this, you see other countries desperately trying to understand what it is that the White House wants, and they're not getting a straight answer on this. So, maybe send Trump to Camp David, get rid of all the smartphones, get rid of all the devices. Okay, he's got to detox from that, get some economic advisors together and ask him, what do you actually want and how do you think you're going to get there? I'm not sure that's going to work. I mean, there's no way he could sit still long enough for that to work. But actually having a coherent strategy at least allows other countries to realize, are we going to be on board with this or not?
Stephen, anything you want to add?
So let me try to give a plausible account of Donald Trump as he actually is, and this administration as it actually is, having some real successes in 4 years' time. I do think that exists, right? I think President Trump's basic view that U.S. foreign policy has been off course for quite some time and has overcommitted itself, especially militarily, is correct. I think his impulse to try to strike deals with U.S. adversaries is also a valuable one. If he is able to end the war in Ukraine on the kind of terms that we've seen floated, basically, that would be an achievement. I doubt that that will happen this year, but if he can stick with it rather than quickly deciding to abandon the effort or abandon Ukraine, or probably less likely escalate the war to put much more pressure on Russia, but not an impossibility, then I think that will be a success because the war in Ukraine, here he and others in his orbit are correct, was not heading toward victory for Ukraine, and in fact there was no real plausible endgame that Trump inherited when he took office in January. So I think it was correct to try to make a serious push to end that conflict. And I think it would also be correct to effectuate a transition to European leadership of European defense. I think to do that responsibly and effectively, it would have to happen with some coordination with allies, and it would unfold over at least a decade to get the U.S. to a genuinely supporting role in European defense. And we may yet see that. And there's some evidence that Europeans themselves are looking to present the Trump administration with a 5 to 10 year plan for how to do this. So, I think that is a very plausible outcome. If he's able to conclude a new nuclear agreement with Iran, again, that would be potentially very positive and would allow the United States to do what Rose is discussing and take a serious step back from its military engagements in the greater Middle East. And now that, even though Trump is very close to the Gulf states, because those Gulf states are themselves less hostile to Iran than they were when the JCPOA was concluded, you could see the Middle East be handed off in better shape, at least for the United States, at the end of this Trump administration than when he inherited it. I think a big question, as we talked about, is China. I think there is a chance that President Trump could, the chance was better before Liberation Day, but could engage in some serious negotiations with Beijing. Obviously, now they have to deal with the trade war. Look, tensions over Taiwan have been too high. I was just in Taipei a few weeks ago. The president, who's now been there for a little less than a year, has been pushing the envelope in asserting the separateness, the sovereignty of Taiwan. I think Washington needs to return to the wisdom of its one China policy and its dual deterrent strategy, in which the United States seeks to deter not only Beijing from attacking Taiwan, but also Taipei from taking destabilizing measures that could provoke an attack, from changing the status quo unilaterally. And that seems like something Trump, with all of his criticism of U.S. allies and partners and his willingness to deal with autocratic adversaries, would be willing to do, but we haven't seen that from him yet. So that's my attempt to answer the question of how this president could be a success. I think what he won't do is stitch together a new international order. That's not what he's about. But as a historian, I could imagine in 20 years looking back and saying, Trump ultimately provided a kind of needed disruption and a course correction, and then later on the United States settled into something more stable, more constructive, and hopefully something that brought some greater dimensions of American engagement with the world back into the mix.
Thank you, Stephen. So in lightning fast fashion, we have covered a lot of different instruments of foreign policy, a lot of geographic regions in the world, a little bit of a reflection of the rapid torrent of new policies that are coming to fruition, but trying to take stock of looking at the past, what's similar or different to what was telegraphed, but also looking ahead, peeking our head around the corner to see what comes. I could have all day to ask lots of questions of these smart people, but I want you in the room to also have a chance. So what we're going to do is we have two runners, I believe, that are going to take questions. I'm going to take questions about 3 at a time. For those of you that feel inspired to filibuster and pontificate, do not be surprised if your microphone goes away, because somebody will be holding it. And it's not an offense to you, but I want to make sure we hear lots of your great questions. And we'll see how we go. I might throw a few more questions to the panelists myself, but why don't we go ahead and throw it open to the crowd? So why don't we start, well, maybe let's go every other. So gentleman up here, gentleman here. I'd like a student, yep. Person in the black, I think you have your hand. Yeah, start with that. And briefly say your name, 30 seconds, and then your question.
Oh, I don't get to hold it. Okay, thank you. My name's Mike McMahon. I'm a local resident. Great discussion. So my question is right down the middle politically. So the current debt is about $36 trillion, which was about $11 trillion more than it was during before the first Trump administration, to include the Biden administration. At what point, from a global policy, should we turn off the spigot, shut off USAID, stop funding wars, that stuff? At what point should we start pulling back, or what should we fund globally and continue to increase our debt? That's my question.
Okay, gentleman in the pink, or red, sorry.
Hi, my name's Jack Haldeman. I'm a local resident also. Welcome to Williamsburg. Thank you for coming. I'm also a layman in foreign policy, but I've been wondering about Syria. How should the United States deal with Syria? What final relationship should we target, and how should we get there?
And right over here in the black shirt.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I'm a junior in international relations here at William & Mary. And you guys talked a little bit about the current uncertainty with, allies and other world leaders. And the other day, Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, came out and said that the U.S.-Canada trading relationship was never going to go back to the way it was before, the last little bit. So I was just wondering if you think the damage has already been done with other world leaders and our allies about whether or not the United States is a trustworthy trading partner. Thank you.
All right, well, we'll leave it there, but I'll ask my microphone folks to, if others in that wanted to ask a question, raise your hand. Maybe I'll have my mic folks pick out a couple of folks. So I'll start with it's Catherine, right? So I'll start with that because that was literally one of the questions I might ask, so good on you. So essentially, perceptions of the U.S., how is that changing? This particular example in Canada, can it go back to the way it was? Your question, Jack, on Syria policy, trying to decode that a little bit more. Mike, I'm going to paraphrase your question as this is essentially the balance between limitless ambition and finite resources. How do you get that right? Although I will say USAID has already been knocked out. So the question is then, how do we actually work with the institutions we have? So I'll throw it to my panelists. Feel free to respond shortly to any number of those questions. Let's start with you, Stephen.
Yeah, just on the first question, the debt is a problem, and foreign aid is a very, very small percent of federal spending. So that's not really solving that problem, no matter what you do with it. But I do think, for reasons of cost, but even security and U.S. interests as well, that the United States needs to retrench militarily. It's not, to me, so much about the financial burden, although we do spend a ton, more than half of our federal discretionary budget on the Pentagon, and the Trump administration says it wants to now make that more than $1 trillion a year, which is real money. But it's also, that the United States is exposed by being on the front lines of potential major conflicts. It is exposed to far greater costs that could really bring about a rapid collapse of the American position in multiple places if a U.S. commitment is tested in Asia or Europe, or we have a large-scale war in the Middle East, like a war with Iran. And that could also strain our finances, add to that the existing issues that we're dealing with. So one of the reasons I think President Trump has been elected is that he was able to capitalize on feelings of discontent over U.S. foreign policy, including wars and nation-building attempts, as you mentioned. And oddly enough, the Democrats, who had a monopoly on that message during the Obama years, have ended up ceding it to the right. So I think that's something that they need to grapple with. And if that optimistic scenario I gave you just a moment ago is to come to pass, in which Trump is a disruptive and transitional figure and we get somewhere better, that does require the other party to be willing to not just mount a rearguard defense of the so-called liberal world order as it existed prior to Trump, but to embrace the need for change, which actually quite a few Democrats do think needs to happen. The course of the Biden administration, I think, is instructive because the Biden administration did have reformist ambitions when it came in and left in a very different place, absent, I'm excluding political economy from that because it did make a number of changes there. Just on the question, I think it is fascinating what the long-term ramifications will be of Trump's trade wars and criticism of allies. Again, it's like tempting to say, well, we had Trump before and he criticized allies and, allies figured, well, it was 4 years and also Trump didn't actually change that much materially in relationships with allies. When you threaten to annex another country, which is a neighbor, that's people are going to remember that. And I don't have a whole lot of, despite my credentials as a historian, a whole lot of cases to draw upon of that are similar, but one can imagine that Canadians will not forget that they were threatened in this way, even if the threats go no further than they have been. On the other hand, we have to look at all allies differently. Allies in Europe, I think, are having a reckoning. They see that the United States is not to be depended upon for their security. I think that's actually a good thing at this point in time. Allies in Asia may view it differently. A lot of depends on how the tariff issue plays out. But I think that they are used to having a more transactional mentality with the United States. And so it's less about a kind of confluence of values for them. So the fact that they may or may not share perceived values with the occupant of the White House, and they may be threatened a little bit, I think it will be less significant for them than it is for NATO allies. But that's not to say that it might not be significant for them too.
Let's go to Rose next. And I wonder, Rose, could you tackle the Syria question in particular, but then any of the other topics, the restraint versus engagement, the global perceptions questions? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of Syria, there's a lot to unpack there potentially, but I think that the best policy, the policy the U.S. should pursue would be some form of benign neglect, which is to say, there's not a lot that goes on in Syria that's going to affect the United States one way or the other. We have sanctions on Syria. They're potentially crushing for the new Syrian government. We could remove them or not remove them. It doesn't make a big difference to the United States either way. I think there's no reason for the United States to have troops in Syria. I'm not sure there was ever a reason, but the previous reason was the Islamic State. U.S. troops were sent there to help defeat the Islamic State in conjunction with, or in cooperation with the Kurds and various other local actors that also wanted to get rid of the Islamic State. And the Islamic State lost all of its territory 5 years ago. So they just are no longer an entity, really, let alone not really a threat. So, the reasons why people want to stay in Syria, there's lots of them that people argue about, like, oh, if we're there, maybe we can have some say in the future of the country. But Syria is a failed state, right? I mean, it's tragic, it's awful for the Syrian people, having gone through, a decade of civil war, and now Assad is gone, which is good, but nobody knows what's going to happen next. Syria is like it's a great opportunity for failed state management, which I don't think is something that the United States really wants to be in the business of handling. And so, I think the United States should get out of Syria. The threats from terrorism are super overblown. I've looked into the threat from ISIS, and as far as I can tell, ISIS itself never actually attacked the United States, in the United States or anywhere else. I'm sure they would have loved to do it, but they were too weak to do it, right? The various sort of ISIS attacks that we experienced in the 2010s was from ISIS wannabes, right? Homegrown, self-radicalized, probably never met a real ISIS fighter in their lives, but pledged some sort of allegiance to them online, right? So, the link to Syria as a base of operations for all of this is super tenuous. ISIS is defeated anyway. And, I think actually the case is really instructive of like, wow, this event happened, Assad got overthrown, and the United States had nothing to do with it, right? Like, this was engineered by Turkey, this was engineered by local groups, to the extent that it's good that Assad is gone, which it is good. I mean, he was a monster, right? The U.S. had nothing to do with it. And, ISIS basically managed to tick off everybody in the region. Like, everybody in the region hated ISIS and worked hard to get rid of them. So Syria is an example where local actors have been able to be far more effective in achieving some of the goals that the United States has wanted than the U.S. has been. So that would be my sort of say on Syria and what I think should happen with Syria. In terms of whether will people remember the U.S., how will they think, how is our reputation going to suffer? I mean, I think as long as Trump is president, this stuff is going to really hurt the U.S. reputation. But Trump is not forever. And whenever Trump is no longer president, maybe it's naive of me, but I'd like to think that the United States would, be able to remind countries of the goodwill it had banked for years and years and years and years, and be able to move forward. And I think actually that I would think a lot of countries would be happy to sort of have the U.S. back as a more normal country and a more consistent country, not necessarily bankrolling the whole world, but just sort of more predictable. I think countries would like that and would reward that.
Dan, do you want to clean up for us?
Sure. On Syria, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Rose, although I defer to her expertise on this. in two ways. First, I think one thing the United States could do would be to lift sanctions, because we really suck at that. We're great at imposing sanctions, and we are horrible at lifting them. And just to get the United States in the habit of lifting sanctions, if the situation changes, that's a good muscle to develop. So regardless of Syria, just to do that. But also, I disagree with the contention that the U.S. did nothing in terms of Syria, which is, you're right, in Syria the U.S. did nothing. But part of the reason that Assad falls is because Russia doesn't do anything because it's tied down in Ukraine. And so this is where you do have to sort of think of this a little more strategically. And this is why I do think there's value in supporting Ukraine in that conflict, I would add, because it prevents Russia from doing a lot of other things in a lot of other areas of the world that would potentially be contrary to U.S. interests. Okay.
At a massive price to Ukrainians, right? And
which
it's a
the price that
significant cost
Ukrainians,
to
I
us
would
too.
argue, are willing to pay. This is where I agree with you that Trump might feel like he wants to end the war, but a truly realpolitik perspective on the war in Ukraine is tie Russia down, bleed them dry. And
Well, that will only work for so long because Ukraine has only so many people.
it's going to
You're
work
bleeding
for-
Ukraine too.
But I would argue it's going to work for a lot longer than you're necessarily believing. And furthermore, the other thing is that it's very clear the Ukrainians want to continue to fight. So the idea that we're somehow sort of going to step in and sort of tell the Ukrainians, no, this is actually what's in your interest, I find equally arrogant.
Well, I think we should say what's in our interests, and
Yeah,
they can
yeah.
make calculations.
On the other questions, in terms of whether folks will trust the U.S. again, the answer is no, not for a generation. You can argue that Trump getting elected in 2016 was a quirk. It was a quirk of the Electoral College. It was a sort of odd moment. And as we've said, throughout this past hour, a lot of what Trump wanted to do, he wound up not doing. The fact is that in 2024, despite everything that had happened previously, he not only got elected, he won the popular vote. And that in and of itself sent a message to the rest of the world of this can happen again. And yes, Donald Trump might not run again, although really there's a 5% chance he's going to try to pull that off, which is a disturbing non-zero percentage. But even if he's gone from the stage, there are going to be others that try to fulfill his destiny. And the idea that there will be a future Republican president that campaigns based on Donald Trump's vision is going to be ever present in the mind of U.S. allies from here on in. And with respect to the budget question, it's worth remembering Donald Trump's first Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, once pointed out that if you want to cut down the budget for the State Department, you're going to have to buy me a lot more ammunition. In other words, if you want to cost effectively try to balance the budget, the way to go after it is not to cut foreign aid in the State Department, it's to cut the Defense Department. And it's weird, again, to use that word, that the Trump administration simultaneously wants Europe and others to pay more for their own defense, and yet we're going to have $1 trillion Defense Department budget. That's an equation I can't add up. If you really are concerned about budget, fiscal probity, you need to go after Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. And it's very clear that's not what they're going to do. And so the idea that you can balance the budget by somehow pursuing a more retrenched U.S. foreign policy, I find risible. And I would also add, and it's worth noting, that one of the most significant secretaries of defense who argued vigorously in favor of expanding the State Department budget was, in fact, Robert Gates in the pages of Foreign Affairs. So it's worth listening to him on this point as well.
I think we're off to a good start because I was ticking through questions I had wanted to ask, and you all asked them for me. So let's go to 3 more questions. Gentleman in the black shirt, gentlewoman in the blue shirt, and the gentleman all the way back in the plaid, I guess.
Hello, sorry.
Introduce
My name is Spencer. I'm a senior, and I study international relations at the college. And I was wondering if you could sort of tie everything that you said into a knot. Where do you see the United States' role in the world being in, say, 10 years' time? Do you see sort of like the post-war U.S. leadership ending? Do you see sort of like powers like China and others rising to take our place in certain areas? Where do you predict that going?
Okay, the lady in the blue.
Hi, I'm Anu. I'm a freshman studying international relations, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on the Golden Dome and on Trump pausing offensive cyber attacks against Russia?
Gentleman in plaid.
Hi, Justin Moore, alumnus of the college, and about 1 million years ago, I had Professor Tierney for 1998 as a professor. But my question was, what do you think the consequences are going to be, if you want to speak to it more in a humanitarian way or in a strategic way, of the gutting and shutting down of USAID and other similar programs?
All right, so picking up on themes here, and I think you probably are in Professor Tierney's class on international order and all of that fun stuff. Yes, okay. So 10 years from now, easy question, U.S. role in the world. What does this look like? Secondly, Golden Dome offense. And thirdly, we haven't talked as much about this on the panel just for lack of time, but one of the other parts of U.S. or President Trump's first 100 days has not only been the amount of executive orders and policy changes coming out, but the changing face of the U.S. government, most notably a lot of our development assistance-focused agencies. So I'll invite you all to reflect on that. Dan, we'll go to you first.
Oh, God. I think a decade from now, forget what I want to happen, what I actually think will be the case is I do really think a lot of what we're going to be seeing from the past 100 days and over the next 3.5 years is going to be pretty long lasting. So I would suspect that the U.S. is going to have a more reduced influence across the world. If the sort of generous interpretation of what Trump will pull off is this sort of spheres of influence view of the world where, he cedes Asia to some extent to China, he cedes, Eurasia to Russia, but in return, the United States presumably exercises a more direct form of hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. So that might be one scenario. Now, to be clear, I don't really think that's going to work terribly well, and there's a whole variety of reasons for that, but that might be the sort of the optimistic Trump spin on what the world winds up looking. In terms of the effect of USAID cutoff, again, it's going to leave a scar. Not a scab, but a scar. There's going to be some permanent residue here. There are a lot of problems with foreign aid. I'm not going to say that USAID was, run perfectly. But one of the things about media coverage on this stuff is always that if a program is in place, it's always easy to point out the ways in which it needs reform. And then if you destroy the program, it turns out, there was all this good stuff that we just took for granted, that we didn't realize what was actually going on. And you've sort of seen that play out over the last 100 days. And I would argue that USAID, by and large, bought a lot more goodwill in the world than, however inefficiently, than destroying it would do.
Stephen?
So I genuinely do not know what the effects of gutting USAID will be. Some aspects of it may be reconstituted even under this administration. But there's a lot of claims about what the effects will be. And I think what's interesting in some of the defenses of AID that have come out in the last several months is that those defending it sort of oscillate between a humanitarian rationale for aid and a strategic rationale. And it's just been a while, actually, since this has been an agency under attack where, affirmative defenses have to be made. So I think we need to do a lot of work to rethink what the basic purposes of AID should be, and then perhaps reconstitute it or refashion it accordingly. But I just don't want to rush to judgment. I mean, AID does a ton of things, so it would be just absurd to sort of, to my mind, to try to encapsulate it all into a neat bow, as the first questioner put it, in a different context. And let me just get to that question. I mean, I think a lot of the changes Trump has made so far that we've been discussing are intensify pre-existing trends. It was the Obama administration that spoke about the world being multipolar, at least for a time. They started to retire that vocabulary. It wasn't very popular. We've seen Secretary of State Marco Rubio revive the notion that the world is multipolar, or as he put it, consists of multiple great powers. And, you know, in many ways, the U.S., since the Obama era, has been trying to grapple with the possibility that it may be overextended, at least militarily, or at least in terms of the commitments, the military commitments that it's made on paper. And I don't think that that can continue, you know, over the course of a decade. So one way or another, the United States, at least its political military role, I think will shrink. So I think there's like basically three options for how you can do that. So we can have large-scale military conflicts with Russia, China, perhaps others in the mix. That's a real possibility. That could well happen in 10 years. Option one, catastrophe. Option two, we do something short of what I think Dan was getting at, which is a kind of retreat to the Western Hemisphere, allowing spheres of influence in entire regions for Russia and China, but rather we, you know, look to make somewhat more accommodating arrangements over the flashpoints that would most likely lead to a conflict with both powers. You know, for China, that is overwhelmingly Taiwan, right? And this is actually an issue where I think we could make real progress if we wanted to put in the effort. And number three would be indeed the kind of spheres of influence scenario in which the United States, you know, really backs away dramatically, or U.S. allies and partners so distrust the United States that they say goodbye to us, which I think is probably a low possibility. And you could have the first and the third combination, so the first and the third option combined. You know, simultaneously there's a war, and maybe it's revealed that the American political system is not willing to incur major costs to, say, take on China in a conflict over Taiwan, and then that leads the United States to recalculate other far-flung commitments that it's made, or leads allies and partners themselves to reevaluate the commitments from the United States.
Rose, I will give you the second to last word before I close this out.
Okay. I don't know if that's a good thing because I tend to be very pessimistic. So like my sort of short answer is for the 10 years question, right?
Wait, I thought I was dark. Wow.
I mean, honestly, I kind of feel like spheres of influence would be less dark than what I think is going to happen, which is, you know, I think the U.S. is going to lose all the good aspects of our leadership, but keep all the commitments. Like, as bad as we are at getting rid of sanctions, like we still have sanctions on Cuba? Like we're still, like, if somehow that,
Very much so,
if
yeah.
that works,
Embargo.
right? Like if Cuba liberalizes, are people going to say this was a successful example of sanctions? That's like 60 years of, anyway. Yeah, we don't take off sanctions. We also don't pull back commitments. And we like make commitments just like by accident, or like, you know, without really thinking through the consequences of it. Like we're not very good at sort of recalling our commitments, right? So even having the Trump administration in place, you know, Trump wanted to get out of Syria the first time around, tried to, and sort of got talked out of it, right? He said this time he wants to get out of Syria, and they just sort of moved some forces around and consolidated them, but we still have 1,000 troops in Syria that are going to be there for who knows how long, for who knows why. Like 10 years from now, we're probably still going to have 1,000 troops in Syria. I mean, you know, God bless you, you are a student. 10 years seems like a long time to you, right? To me, 10 years is not very long, right? I would be very surprised if the US is able to walk back things that are, I mean, you know, we don't even really, people talk about having a commitment to the Kurds. Like, we don't even have a commitment to the Kurds, but anybody that we work with in any way, it's like then we sort of feel like we're stuck with them and we have to protect them, or it metastasizes into this like bureaucratic inertia of like, well, but what about these people or those people, or, you know, yeah.
Sorry, also don't forget,
That's okay.
or when we actually do pull out, like in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
a huge political price is paid for that.
Yep.
I don't think a political price was paid for that. I really don't.
Oh.
Oh, I
No,
don't.
no, I disagree. Joe,
Yeah,
take a look at Joe
no.
Biden's approval numbers and
Yeah.
watch where they go south.
Yeah,
Did
but
coincide with
Do you-
Delta, I believe it was, for the pandemic. But I agree, I think he paid a price. Clearly, though, we don't like to
we don't like to
leave,
pull out. We don't like
and
to
we don't
leave.
like to end a commitment.
I'm not
Don't
saying it
like
was a
to
bad
end
idea.
yeah.
I'm saying there's a political
Yeah.
price that's paid.
Domestically or internationally?
Domestically.
Domestically, I don't think people care. I think people cared that it was mismanaged.
Hey, guys, we're going to have to save this for the
Yeah.
after.
I think people cared that it was mismanaged.
There's nothing
And
like
that people got
hors d'oeuvres for,
killed, right?
robust discussion and
Yes,
debate.
yeah,
Do you want to
but-
land the plane for us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the pullout was not managed well, but I think actually Americans are very glad that we're no longer at war in Afghanistan.
All right. That wasn't a
And
bad.
I've landed.
Excellent. And this can be the start, the warm up for a conversation that I imagine will be pretty robust and dynamic in the other room in just a moment with food and drink and conversation. But let me just land the plane myself here. I think what we've covered tonight is this isn't easy. I have actually, in my own research, I study things like foreign aid, strategic communications, how countries use and build soft power. So this has been a challenging time for me to navigate. But I think that one of the things that we have a responsibility collectively to do is to say, one of the most challenging aspects of reform is inertia. That is not our problem right now. Right? We don't have an inertia problem. And so that is an opportunity to engage in these difficult, uncomfortable conversations and questions about how do we do a rethink and a reset of where we want to be, at the end of this administration, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So with that is your homework. As a good professor, I'm going to give you your homework. Find a friend in the other room and contemplate these questions. Thank you very much to our panelists and to all of you.